Hi everybody, and welcome back to Plant Adaptations to Shade. In this second unit, you'll be learning about the adaptations that sun-loving plants have evolved to help them survive being planted in the shade. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to describe sun-loving plants' adaptations to shade and describe how you might notice these in a landscape. From a physiological point of view, the shade tolerance of any given plant can be defined as the minimum light under which a plant can survive. And survival may be all that we're looking for in a cultivated ornamental landscape. In their natural habitat, though, plants need to reproduce in order to ensure the survival of the species. Therefore, from a biological or ecological point of view, shade tolerance is better defined as the minimum amount of light a given plant needs to sustain it through all stages of its life cycle, including blooming and the production of viable seed. The production of viable seed involves successful pollination and fertilization. So for animal pollinated plants, this means that the plant has to be in a location and light exposure where its pollinators aren't just present but also active. Heliophytes, the sun-loving or shade-avoiding plants, have evolved to grow best in sunlight, but they've also evolved a range of adaptations that enable them to adjust, to some extent, to survive in shaded locations, like this California blue blossom on the right, for example, which performs really well in full sun and will still bloom in relatively dense shade. The ability of the sun lovers to adapt to shade, though, is limited, and they're never going to perform at their physiological optimum. So you might be asking, why would we want to plant sun-loving plants in a location where they're not going to perform at their best? Well, there are sometimes occasions where we don't want to select shade-loving plants for a particular location. Perhaps there's a planter bed where the exposure changes halfway along from sun to light shade, and changing the plant palette might spoil the aesthetics, the unity of the planter bed. Or perhaps we're working with a client who absolutely insists on having a particular sun-loving plant in their landscape, even though the whole of their landscape is in the shade. In these types of situations, we need to be able to select sun-loving plants for that shaded spot that'll still perform acceptably from aesthetic and functional points of view. This is where experience and perhaps looking at other landscapes really helps. You learn firsthand or secondhand, if you're looking at other people's landscapes, which sun-loving plants still perform well in shade. Let's take a look now at how sun-loving plants can adapt to situations where the light conditions or exposure are less than optimal for them. Photosynthesis in sun lovers tends to be relatively inefficient under poor light, but they've got the ability to divert scarce energy into vital functions. For starters, they can increase the total amount of chlorophyll in their leaves, which increases photosynthetic efficiency. For us humans, we see this as the leaves appearing to be darker green. Pigmented and variegated leaves may lose their coloration as more chlorophyll is produced. For example, this variegated selection of Fatsia japonica will lose some of its variegation if it's planted in too much shade. The herbaceous ground covers, Ajuga reptans, Catlin's giant, and black scallop, have dark purplish burgundy foliage and are fairly shade tolerant, but their leaves will turn a dark muddy green when they're planted in too much shade, and therefore they've lost much of their attraction. You may notice something similar happening on a plant that's planted in full sun, where the upper stems are shading the lower leaves, especially ones towards the center of the plant. This is usually really obvious in the popular shrub Sunset Gold Breath of Heaven. This selection of Breath of Heaven has golden yellow or chartreuse foliage. And if you look at the lower stems towards the middle of the plant, you'll see that the leaves are usually much greener because they're adapted to being shaded by producing more chlorophyll. If you plant Sunset Gold in the shade, the whole plant will appear greener, and it can end up looking not much different to the green-leaved straight species. A second way in which sun-loving plants can adapt to shade is by developing leaves that are both thinner and larger in order to increase the surface area that's exposed to light and reduce the distance that light has to travel through the leaf before it reaches the chloroplasts. It does this by developing a thinner waxy cuticle, which is this protective layer. Think of it as sunscreen right on the top of the leaf surface right there. And it also develops a thinner epidermis, which enables the light to pass through much more efficiently to the chloroplasts to improve photosynthetic efficiency. Chloroplasts are the organelles in leaf cells where the pigment chlorophyll harvests light and photosynthesis takes place. And chloroplasts are in these palisade mesophyll cells right here, just below the epidermis. The larger surface area of the leaf increases the number of palisade mesophyll cells that are right there under the epidermis, and this results in an increase in the number of chloroplasts and therefore improved collection of light. Another way in which sun-loving plants can adapt to shade is through positive phototropism. This means that the plants are diverting energy into elongated stem growth so the stems can grow toward the light. In the photo on the right, you can see a pot of young seedlings being grown indoors on a windowsill, and you can tell by the curved stems that the seedlings are growing towards the light source. In fact, you can tell that this pot must have been turned at some point because the stems are leaning towards the left at the bottom, and then the most recent growth at the top of the stems is now leaning towards the right, where the light's coming from. Positive phototropism doesn't always result in stems that are angled towards a light source. If the light source is coming from above, then the stems will be elongated and stretched vertically. This can easily happen in a greenhouse when you're growing plants close together. It can also happen outdoors in a nursery when plants have been lined out too close together. Elongated, stretched stems means thinner stems, which results in a weaker plant. Another symptom of phototropism and elongated stem growth is longer internodes. So the space between the lateral stems is longer. From an aesthetic point of view, this results in a plant's growth habit being less compact, or the foliage appearing less dense because the stems and leaves are spaced further apart. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that you need to be aware of, as it may have an impact on the aesthetics of a planting scheme. The opposite of positive phototropism is negative phototropism, and this is actually an aside. This has nothing to do with plant adaptations to shade. Negative phototropism is a common phenomenon in vines, especially twining vines like wisteria and vines with tendrils. Twining plants go through an alternating process of negative and positive phototropism. The stem grows away from the light and towards a plant or a structure, a post for example, that it then starts to twine around. It then exhibits positive phototropism to grow back around the support and towards the light. This process continues, and the result is a vine that is twining around its support. Some vines have tendrils, which are modified leaves, and these exhibit negative phototropism as they grow towards something that they can grasp onto to support the plant as it grows. So don't confuse phototropism with heliotropism. Heliotropism is the seasonal or diurnal pattern of some plant parts, such as leaves or flowers, turning towards the sun on a regular basis to capture the maximum amount of light. Heliotropism isn't an adaptation to shade. Sunflowers are probably one of the best known examples of plants that do track the sun through heliotropism, and there's a link here to a very short video clip that was filmed at UC Davis of sunflowers doing this. Another adaptation of sun-loving plants to shade is the abscission of older leaves. Older leaves are less efficient at photosynthesis, and therefore the plant drops them because basically they're not earning their keep. In a landscape, you may notice that in addition to looking less dense or compact, plants planted in too much shade may have very few or no older leaves towards the base of their stems. This can also happen to sun-loving plants that are planted in the sun and are frequently hedged or pruned into shapes. The pruning encourages a lot of new growth at the stem tips, which then shades the middle of the shrub. When you look into the center of the shrub, you'll see that there are very few leaves on the stems in the middle because the plant has dropped them. This is probably the case with these Cotonia lacteus that you can see in the picture on the right. These are on Perimeter Road going up the hill at Cabrillo, and these shrubs are regularly hedged by the maintenance crew at Cabrillo. And if you were to look into the middle of these shrubs, then you're probably not going to see any leaves. So here's the last adaptation to shade. The production of flowers and fruit is really energy intensive and, of course, requires light. Less light means less energy, and therefore plants planted in too much shade usually produce fewer flowers than they do in locations with more light. They may even not bloom at all. Fewer or no flowers means less or no fruit. So fruit trees, for example, will be less productive or even not productive at all in shaded locations. Remember that pollination needs to happen before fruit can be produced, and insect pollinators such as bees are often not as active in cooler, shadier locations as they are in warm, sunny locations. So even if a tree blooms in the shade, it's possible that the flowers may not get pollinated because the bees aren't flying in that shaded location. So let's bring this to a conclusion now. You've seen now that plants have some ability to adapt to growing in less than optimal light conditions. As landscape professionals, we need to be able to select sun-loving plants that will perform well in shade when the need arises. We also need to know the consequences of doing this, the effect it'll have on the growth habit of a plant, the effect it'll have on the foliage, and the possible reduction in flowering and fruiting. We may also have to warn a client of these possibilities if they absolutely insist on having a particular sun-loving plant planted in a shaded location in their landscape. Another practical scenario where it helps to have a knowledge of these plant adaptations to shade is where a client points out a particular plant in an area of their garden and asks you why it's not blooming or why it's not producing fruit. There are other causes of these conditions, but if the plant looks healthy, then often the most likely cause is that the plant's been planted in too much shade. And now that you know how to evaluate a landscape for shade, and you know about plant adaptations to shade, you should be able to answer this question with some degree of confidence. So that's the end of this unit now. Take a break or return to Canvas and continue with the third part of this lecture series on plant adaptations to shade.